to make a quick video to help you understand some concepts to help your child if they are struggling with compound and complex sentences. There are so many prerequisite background skills that come into this. So if you're listening to this and you feel like, oh my goodness, I can't remember how to find the subject of the sentence or something like that, you might have to pause it, go back and watch a video on that skill and then come back, because I don't have time to start from scratch. Also, I'm going to talk kind of fast just because I know no one's going to listen to this video if it gets too long. Okay, the first thing your child has to understand is the difference between a phrase or a fragment and a clause. So, to be a clause, there must be a subject and a verb. So, if you've got a group of words and it's missing a subject or it's missing the verb or both, then we would consider it a phrase or a fragment, meaning it cannot stand alone, like this little robot here. It couldn't be a complete sentence. So this period here is incorrect. After playing outside, that's a mistake. That can't stand alone, okay? Now, when we have our clauses, as I said, it must have a subject and a verb. That's key to what we're going to do later. So I told the kids, here's how you can remember it. Okay, as a Christian, the Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, that is the foundation of who you are as a Christian. God made you. So if you don't have God, we don't have you. You don't exist. Well, in the same way, the subject and the verb are like the foundation of a clause. They make the clause. If you take away the subject or the verb or both, you no longer have a clause. You're back to the phrase or the fragment. Now, the two types of clauses that we're studying are dependent and independent clauses. So the difference is the independent clause, it makes sense all by itself. It could be a complete sentence. So it's correct to put the period here. We play outside. Now, a dependent clause, however, cannot stand alone yet. It's close, but the dependent clause, we're going to talk later, is going to start with a subordinate conjunction that leaves you hanging. So, for example, if I say, after we play outside, and I walk up to someone and I say that, they're going to be waiting for me to finish my sentence. It's dependent on more information. So basically, if you take an independent clause and you choose to start it with what we call a subordinate conjunction or an AWUBIS word, and that might be something you need to pause and research and look up. But if you start it with a subordinate conjunction, that turns it into a dependent clause because it leaves you hanging. So dependent clause can't be a standalone sentence, so this period is incorrect here. I need to know more information. Independent clause can stand alone as its own sentence. Okay, that's super important to understand these three different ideas when we're moving forward with compound and complex sentences. Okay, so this slide, I realize it looks like a lot of information, but let me talk you through it. Okay, I'm trying to summarize here. So here, this is supposed to show a dependent clause, and this is our independent clause, okay? So you'll notice they both have to have subject-verb teams, but our dependent clause is going to start with a word called a subordinate conjunction. There are some other ways to start a dependent clause, but most of the time it's a subordinate conjunction, and that's all we're focusing on in 5th grade. So there's this, like in the grammar world, there's this saying for subordinate conjunctions, it's AWUBIS, to remember some of the most common ones: after, although, as, when, while, until, because, before, if, since. So I told the kids, okay, we have to remember, and just trust me on this, that this is important. Your kid can hopefully explain to you why it's important. The child has to, or anyone needs to understand that the subordinate conjunction is technically considered inside the clause that comes after it. So when you know it starts a clause, start being the key word, and it's in the clause. Whereas when I am using a fanboy, which is also called a coordinate conjunction, when I'm using a fanboy to join two clauses, like down here, they need to understand that the fanboy technically is not a part of either clause. The reason it's important for them to understand this is when we read a dependent clause, it's obvious that it's a dependent clause because it leaves you hanging. For example, a dependent clause could be because I sat on the bench, or after I sat on the bench, or while I sat on the bench. And they need to know, okay, well, this is leaving me hanging. The problem is if your child thinks that this fanboy, this coordinate conjunction, if they think that that is technically a part of the clause after it, they're going to be confused and they're going to be like, okay, but I sat on the bench. And they're going to be like, that leaves me hanging. So the distinction is, if I included but in this, it would leave me hanging, but I don't include it because it's a fanboy. The fanboys stand for and, nor, but, or, yet, so. And we have been building this background knowledge all year leading up to this, if it sounds like a lot. It is a lot, but we've been working on it, okay? So the fanboy, which joins two independent clauses, is not included in either clause, okay? The subordinate conjunction starts a dependent clause, and we'll talk more about dependent clauses on a future slide. Now, this right here is to show that the rule about fanboys not being inside the clause only applies to when it's being used to join two clauses, as opposed to a compound subject. Luke and Lottie played. This is obviously inside the clause. There's no way to take it out of the clause. Okay? Moving on. Okay, the purpose of this slide is to summarize the two different conjunctions. So you've got the coordinate conjunction, which is known as a fanboy. I told the kids, okay, here's how we're going to remember coordinate conjunction and fanboy is the same. You plug the fan into the wall with a cord. So it's a coordinate conjunction. And we've been learning all year that coordinate conjunctions join two independent clauses to form a compound sentence. Okay? Have your child explain why this ninja arm or this super strong arm is here. Okay? Now over here, we have your child, anyone needs to know that subordinate conjunctions, which we just talked about, that they start a dependent clause. They're also known as the awubis words. After, although, as, when, while, until, because, before, if, since. I've been telling them there's so many subordinate conjunctions. We don't want to memorize them all. So what we're going to do for this quiz, we just have to know, and you'll understand why on the next slide, we just have to know which conjunction we're using so we can do process of elimination. If I'm using a fanboy to join two clauses, that means both clauses are independent and it's a compound sentence. If I'm using a subordinate conjunction to join my clauses, that means one of them is going to be a dependent clause, meaning the other one has to be an independent clause. All that to say it's a complex sentence. So let me simplify. If the clauses are joined with a fanboy, it's a compound sentence. If they are not joined with a fanboy, it's a complex sentence. And so I told them, okay, it gets really confusing because we have to decide once we know what type of sentence, if and where we need the comma. So I told them, okay, guys, the rule for fanboy is so easy. Look back here. If I am using a fanboy to join two independent clauses, I always, always, always put a comma before the fanboy. So independent clauses being joined by a fanboy, they always form compound sentences, and we always need a comma. So that's pretty easy. And then I said, okay, two different rule books. Don't confuse them. We just talked about the rule for compound sentences. Let's talk about the rule if I'm using a subordinate conjunction to join my clauses. That's what we're going to look at on the next slide. Okay, so here are the rules for complex sentences, meaning I have an independent clause that can stand alone and a dependent clause that cannot stand alone. So the dependent clause is going to start with a subordinate conjunction, like the word because. It's a word that when you add it in front of the clause, it leaves you hanging. I can't just walk up to someone and be like, because I love you. If I do that, they're going to be staring at me, waiting for me to finish my thought. It can't stand alone. It's dependent on more information to form a complete sentence. So this visual here shows that if I start my sentence with the dependent clause, naturally, my joining word is at the start of the sentence instead of in between the two clauses. And I told my kids, that's just weird. It's just weird that the joining word is not in between them. And I told them, we don't want to just crash our clauses together. We need something in between them to join them. I told them to think of the comma as like a magnetic force. And it's like holding the two clauses together. If I don't have a conjunction there, I add the comma there to hold them together. However, if I start with my independent clause, followed by a dependent clause, then naturally my joining word, my subordinate conjunction, just naturally appears where we feel like it belongs, between the two clauses to hold them together. So if that is the case, we're actually not allowed or not supposed to put a comma there, because it usually results in an awkward pause. So if my joining word is in the middle, where it makes sense, I do not put a comma. So those are the rules for how do I know if I need a comma or not with a complex sentence. Now, this slide was really to summarize for the kids why this is important. They don't necessarily need to know this for the quiz, so I'm going to skip over it for now. Okay, now this was like a last slide. Hey, let's summarize it. Let's put it all together. The main mistake that kids make on this quiz year after year is they forget that to be a compound or complex sentence, there must be two clauses. So right here, if I have a sentence with a subject noun and two verbs joined by a conjunction, I don't have two clauses because I don't have two subject verb teams. We've talked about this a lot in class. You'd have to have a subject and a verb here, and then the conjunction, and then another subject and a verb here. So this is an image to represent a simple sentence with a compound verb, meaning like one person doing two things. So like Luke ran and jumped, or Lottie smiled and laughed. That type of sentence would not need a comma because I don't have a subject after that. If I changed Lottie smiled and laughed to Lottie smiled and she laughed, then I'd have another subject. Then I'd by nature have two clauses, and I would put the comma in front of it. I know it's complicated. I promise we've been working on this so much this year. Your child should be very strong with compound sentences. The complex sentences are the new ones that might be hard for this quiz. But I have told them, okay, so the first step is you see if you have two, what I call subject verb teams, two subjects and verbs working together. So for example, Luke ran and Lottie sat. Luke ran as a clause, Lottie sat as a clause. Subject verb teams, okay? So if you notice you have two subject verb teams, so two subject verbs working together, all you have to do then is find the conjunction. If a fanboy is joining them, you know it's going to be in the middle and it's going to need a comma in front of it. If a subordinate conjunction is joining them, it gets a little more complicated, and that's where the rule book comes into place. If my conjunction is not between the two clauses, I add the comma. If my conjunction is between the two clauses, I don't put a comma. So I just tell the kids, you've got to remember the two different rule books, because if I'm using a fanboy to join them, like for and, nor, but, or, yet, so, it's the opposite rule. If I have a fanboy in between my clauses, I have to use a comma. But if I have a subordinate conjunction, like in a WUBIS word, after, although, as, when, while, until, because, before, if, since, then I don't put a comma. Okay, I realize this sounds complicated if I'm just going through this for the first time, because there's probably so much background knowledge, and if you don't remember those things, this is going to be very complicated. But I promise you, we have talked about all of these things very thoroughly in class, building up to this point. So watch this video. If you're still confused, have your child come to me for tutoring. You can come to me for tutoring if you want to be able to help your child. I realize it's a lot. We try really hard to break it down, and it kind of like everything builds on the next thing. Okay, thanks. I hope this helped.